In May of 1946, in a courtroom in the bombed-out city of Nuremberg, Germany, a sworn affidavit arrived from across the Atlantic Ocean. It was signed by a 5-star American admiral. It saved the life of a Nazi. The Nazi was Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet. He was on trial for, among other things, the crime of sinking merchant ships without warning. The admiral was Chester W. Nimitz, and what he swore under oath was that the United States Navy had been doing the exact same thing for 4 years in the Pacific Ocean on direct orders from Washington, from the very first hour of the very first day of the war. This is the story of how a war crime won the Pacific. The men who carried it out were the smallest, strangest branch of the United States Navy. Less than 2% of its sailors, more than half of its enemy's losses. And when they came home, most of them never spoke about it again. It begins on a Sunday morning in December of 1941. It is 7:48 in the morning at Pearl Harbor. The first wave of Japanese aircraft drops out of the clouds over the island of Oahu. 353 planes. Torpedo bombers skimming the water like cold knives. Dive bombers screaming down on Battleship Row. Within 7 minutes, the USS Arizona takes a 1,760-pound armor-piercing bomb through her forward magazine. The explosion lifts the bow of a 31,000-ton ship clear out of the water and breaks her in half. 1,177 men die before the second wave even arrives. By the time the last Japanese aircraft turns north for its carriers, 21 ships of the United States Pacific Fleet are sinking, burning, or shattered at their moorings. 8 battleships are hit. 4 go to the bottom of the harbor. 2,403 Americans are dead. The surface fleet that was supposed to fight Japan for control of the Pacific is now a graveyard of warped steel and oil-slicked water. But the Japanese pilots, racing back to their carriers with smoke trailing from a few wings, miss something. They miss it deliberately, in fact. Their attack plans, drawn up over months in the wardrooms of Admiral Yamamoto's staff, mark the submarine pier at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard as a low-priority target. The submarines, they decide, do not matter. The submarines will not change the war, so they leave them alone. At the submarine base, moored bow to stern in the smoke, sit 4 American fleet submarines. Across the wider Pacific Fleet, 51 fleet boats are operational. A handful of aging S-class veterans from the last war round out the force. Not a single one is sunk. Not a single hull is breached. They are the only offensive weapon the United States has left in the Pacific Ocean. And in Washington, just hours after the first bomb falls on Pearl Harbor, an admiral named Harold Stark, the chief of naval operations, sits at his desk in the Navy Department and dictates a signal. The signal is 1 sentence long. It will be remembered as one of the most consequential sentences ever sent by the United States Navy. Execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare. For 20 years, the United States has signed treaty after treaty forbidding exactly this. The London Naval Treaty of 1930, the Submarine Protocol of 1936. American diplomats have stood at podiums in Geneva and London and condemned the Imperial German Navy for sinking unarmed merchant ships without warning. When U-boats torpedoed the Lusitania in 1915, the United States nearly went to war over it. Now, in a single radio transmission, that entire moral architecture is set on fire. The logic is cold and the logic is correct. Japan's empire stretches across 20 million square miles of open water. Every barrel of oil from Borneo, every ton of rice from Indochina, every replacement infantryman from the home islands has to travel on the deck of a merchant ship. Cut the lines, starve the empire. The submarines are the only weapon that can reach those lines. What no one yet knows is that the man who will inherit this order, the man who will turn it into a weapon that wins the war, has not yet arrived at Pearl Harbor. Chester William Nimitz is 56 years old. He is the grandson of German immigrants who settled in the Texas Hill Country in the 1840s. His grandfather built a small hotel in the town of Fredericksburg shaped, of all things, like a steamboat. His father died 6 months before he was born. He is quiet, methodical, almost impossible to anger. When he smiles, it is the small, contained smile of a man who has already thought 3 moves ahead and has decided not to share them. In the previous war, the war they used to call the Great War, Nimitz served as Chief of Staff of the Atlantic Submarine Force. He has lived on submarines. He has commanded them. He has felt the deck heel under his boots in heavy weather and listened to the diesel engines cough to life at 3 in the morning. He knows what these boats can do. He knows what they cannot do. He knows the difference between a captain who reports a contact and a captain who attacks one. On the last day of 1941, on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz reads aloud the orders that make him Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. There is no battleship available for the ceremony. They are all underwater. The choice of a submarine for the swearing-in is not symbolic on purpose. It is symbolic by accident. But it is a symbol all the same. He inherits a fleet of corpses, an ocean the size of 3 continents, and an order to wage a kind of war that 2 months ago his own government had called a crime. He accepts all of it. To understand what the men of the Silent Service are about to do, you have to understand first what they are doing it inside of. A fleet submarine of the Gato class is 311 feet long. She carries a crew of around 80 men. From the outside, she looks like a sleek black shark. From the inside, she is something closer to a coffin with diesel engines. Every patrol lasts 60 to 75 days. The air thickens with diesel fumes from the moment the boat clears the harbor. There is no air conditioning that works for long. In the tropics, the interior temperature climbs past 100 degrees Fahrenheit and stays there. Sweat soaks into mattresses that nobody ever changes. The bunks are stacked 3 high and a man does not get his own. Hot bunking, they call it. One sailor crawls out of the sheets to start a watch. Another sailor crawls into the still warm sheets to sleep. Fresh water is rationed by the cupful. Showers are forbidden for weeks at a time. The cooks ration eggs powdered in cardboard drums and flour that breeds weevils inside the bag. By the end of a long patrol, every loaf of bread that comes out of the galley has small, dark specks baked through it. The men joke that the weevils add protein. They eat the bread anyway, they have nothing else. None of this is the real danger. The real danger is the sound a depth charge makes underwater. A Japanese destroyer rolls a 350-pound depth charge over the stern. It sinks toward a preset depth. When it detonates, the shock wave reaches a submerged submarine through the only medium that carries sound better than air. Water. The lights flicker and die. Cork insulation flies off the bulkheads in small brown flakes. Glass gauges shatter inward. The hull groans like a living thing in pain. A close miss can crack the pressure hull at a seam. A direct hit will compress the boat into scrap at 300 feet below the surface, with no one to hear it, and no one to find it, and no one to bring the bodies home. By the end of the war, 52 American submarines will not return from patrol. 3,506 officers and enlisted men will die under the Pacific. The casualty rate will reach 22%. 1 man in every 5 who goes on patrol does not come back. It is the highest loss rate of any branch of the United States military in the Second World War. Not the Marines on Iwo Jima. Not the bomber crews over Germany, the men in the steel tubes under the ocean. And yet, in Tokyo on the Naval General Staff of the Imperial Japanese Navy, no one sees this threat coming. Anti-submarine warfare in Japan is, in 1941, the responsibility of exactly 1 officer, 1 man, on a staff of hundreds. Convoy escort is considered a humiliation for a destroyer captain. Destroyers are warships, the Japanese argue. Warships are designed to fight other warships. Babysitting freighters is for the Royal Navy, for the cautious, for the weak. Sonar crews on Japanese escorts are poorly trained. Depth charge tactics are years behind British and American doctrine. There is no national convoy system. Merchant captains sail more or less alone, on the routes they have always sailed, on schedules everyone in the empire seems to know by heart. The Japanese will pay for this in cargo and in carriers and eventually in cities. But they do not pay for it yet, because in the first 18 months of the Pacific War, the American submarine force is failing. The numbers, in retrospect, are almost embarrassing. In all of 1942, the most lethal force the United States has put into the Pacific manages to sink 134 Japanese merchant ships. The total tonnage barely scrapes 580,000 tons. Japanese shipyards launch new vessels faster than American submarines can destroy old ones. The net loss to the Japanese merchant fleet after 12 months of war is effectively zero. Something is deeply, catastrophically wrong. The problem is not the boats. The Gato class is the best submarine afloat in 1942. The problem is not the crews. The crews are volunteers, young and well-trained and willing to die. The problem is the men sitting in the captain's chair. For 20 years between the wars, the United States Navy trained its submarine captains for a war that nobody actually intended to fight. Peacetime doctrine taught one principle above all others: caution. Survive the exercise. Bring the boat home. Approach submerged, fire from maximum range. If the destroyer turns toward you, you have already failed. It was a doctrine designed by careful men, for careful men, in a careful peace. And it is now meeting Imperial Japan. The reports start coming back to Pearl Harbor in early 1942. They have a certain quality to them, a flatness. A captain spots a Japanese convoy at 15,000 yards and decides the approach is too risky. He logs the contact and slips away. Another captain detects a tanker on the horizon, alone unescorted, fat with oil. He calculates the angles, looks at the weather, decides the seas are too rough. He logs the contact and slips away. Patrol after patrol returns to Pearl Harbor with torpedoes still sealed in the tubes, untouched since the day the boat sailed. Inside the submarine force, the very structure of command does something dangerous. A captain at sea, submerged, alone, hundreds of miles from any superior officer, answers to no one in the moment of decision. He can spend 60 days carefully avoiding the enemy, and no one in Pearl Harbor will know until he returns. The patrol report is whatever he says it is. The contacts not engaged are contacts that, on paper, simply never happened. The cautious captains are killing the war. And Chester Nimitz, in his office at Pearl Harbor, with the wall maps and the casualty lists, and the quiet, methodical patience that defines him, knows it. He cannot fix it yet. He does not have the right man in the right chair. The current commander of the Pacific Submarine Force is a competent administrator named Robert English. Nimitz lets him work. He waits. He watches the patrol reports. He counts the torpedoes that come home unfired. There is one detail from the next 4 years that almost no one alive in 1942 could have predicted. It is the detail this entire story is, in the end, about. In May 1946, in the city of Nuremberg, Germany, in a courtroom where the men of the Third Reich are on trial for their lives, a sworn affidavit will arrive from across the Atlantic. The affidavit will be signed by Chester W. Nimitz, Fleet Admiral, United States Navy. It will testify, in calm and methodical language, that the United States Navy waged strict submarine warfare in the Pacific from the first hour of the first day. It will testify that American submarines were ordered to sink Japanese merchant ships without warning. It will testify that this was a deliberate strategy of the United States government. The man whose life the affidavit will save is named Karl Dönitz. He is the commander of the German U-boat fleet. He is, among other charges, accused of waging unrestricted submarine warfare. Nimitz's testimony will not absolve him of everything, but it will keep him from hanging for that crime. The Pacific submarine campaign that is about to begin will sink 1 Japanese battleship, 8 carriers, 11 cruisers, 42 destroyers, and more than 5 million tons of Japanese shipping. It will be conducted by less than 2% of the United States Navy. It will, by some measures, be the single most efficient instrument of victory in any theater of the Second World War, and it will be conducted using methods that, when used by Germans, are crimes against humanity. This is the story of the men who used them, the captains the Navy had given up on, the boats the planners forgot about, the strategy nobody in Washington wanted to discuss in public. In the early months of 1943, Nimitz finally has the names of the men he needs. Two of them are about to be quietly removed from their commands for being too aggressive. One of them is about to die in a plane crash over the California coast, opening up a job that will be inherited by a man named Charles Lockwood, and on a defective submarine that has just limped back from a third failed patrol, a 35-year-old lieutenant commander from Kentucky, with a slow drawl and a reputation for getting himself relieved of duty, is about to be handed the keys to a boat called the USS Wahoo. His name is Dudley Walker Morton. His friends call him Mush, and he is about to terrify both navies. Before we follow Mush Morton onto the deck of the USS Wahoo, we have to talk about a plane crash. On the morning of January 21, 1943, Rear Admiral Robert English boards a Pan American clipper at the Treasure Island Terminal in San Francisco. He is 55 years old. He is the current commander of the Pacific Submarine Force. He has been doing the job for almost a year, since the previous commander was killed in another plane crash 6 months earlier. The job is starting to feel cursed. He is flying west back to Pearl Harbor after a round of meetings in Washington. He never gets there. A few hours after takeoff, in heavy weather over Northern California, the clipper drifts off course and slams into the side of a mountain near Boggs Peak in Lake County. There are no survivors. The wreckage smolders in the rain for a day before search parties find it. English is identified by his uniform. 1,000 miles away in Brisbane, Australia, the news reaches a 52-year-old Vice Admiral named Charles Andrews Lockwood. Lockwood has been running the smaller submarine force in the Southwest Pacific. He is short, balding, blunt-spoken, and famously protective of his men. They call him Uncle Charlie. He has been waiting quietly for the larger command. Now it falls into his lap because another good man is dead on a hillside. He flies to Pearl Harbor in February. He inherits Robert English's office, Robert English's maps, and Robert English's problem. He inherits, in other words, a war that is not being won. Lockwood sits down with a captain named John Brown, a man known throughout the submarine service as Babe. Brown is a big, gentle, slow-spoon football star from the Annapolis class of 1914. He played tackle for Navy and never quite lost the build. He is now the Chief of Staff for training. He is, in Lockwood's words, the one man in the Pacific Fleet who has read every single patrol report submitted by every single submarine captain since the day Pearl Harbor burned. The two men spread the reports across the desk. There are stacks of them, hundreds. They are looking for one specific thing: aggression. Not paperwork, not seamanship, not crew morale, aggression. They circle the names that lack it. In the next 18 months, fully 1/3 of the commanding officers in the Pacific Submarine Force will be quietly removed from their boats. Some are transferred to desk jobs in Washington. Some are sent to training commands in the United States, where they will spend the rest of the war teaching young officers how to do a job they themselves never managed to do. The official paperwork is gentle. The unofficial reality is brutal. The Navy is firing its own captains by the dozen. But here is where the story turns, because Lockwood and Brown are about to discover that some of the men they have already condemned are not the problem. The problem is the torpedo. The Mark 14 torpedo is the standard offensive weapon of the United States submarine fleet. It is 21 inches in diameter, 20 feet long, and weighs over 3,000 pounds. It carries a 643-pound warhead of Torpex explosive, enough to break the back of a destroyer. It does not work. It runs an average of 11 feet deeper than the depth set on the gyroscope. Captains setting their fish for 10 feet, expecting a hit on the waterline of a Japanese tanker, watch them slide harmlessly under the keel into the open sea beyond. It is armed with a magnetic exploder, an experimental device meant to detonate the warhead in the magnetic field of a ship's hull, blowing the bottom out from below. The magnetic exploder does not work. It detonates prematurely, throwing up harmless geysers of seawater 50 yards short of the target. Or it does not detonate at all, and the torpedo continues on into the empty Pacific until its fuel runs out. It is also armed with a backup contact exploder designed to fire on impact. The contact exploder does not work either. When the torpedo strikes the side of an enemy ship at the perfect angle, perpendicular and dead center, the firing pin crushes against the housing instead of striking the primer. The torpedo bounces off with a hollow thud and sinks. Submarine captains, men who had risked their crews to set up textbook attacks, were watching their weapons fail one after another. They came home empty. Their patrol reports were dismissed as excuses. Their careers were quietly destroyed. When Lockwood and his predecessors brought the failures to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, a department known throughout the Navy by the four-letter acronym BUORD, the Bureau's response was a wall of stone. The torpedoes were fine, BUORD insisted. The captains were missing. The maintenance was sloppy. The exploders had been tested in peacetime exercises, and the exercises had gone beautifully. The exercises, it turned out, had been conducted with practice warheads. No live tests had ever been run. Lockwood goes to a conference of senior officers in Washington in the spring of 1943. He listens to the BUORD representatives explain, again, that the Mark 14 is performing as designed. When his turn to speak comes, he leans across the table. If the Bureau of Ordnance cannot provide us with torpedoes that will hit and explode, he says, then for God's sake, get the Bureau of Ships to design us a boat hook with which we can rip the plates off the side of a Japanese ship. The room is silent. He goes back to Pearl Harbor and does what no admiral has done before. He runs his own tests. He picks a stretch of sheltered water called Frenchman's Bay off the coast of Albany in Western Australia. There, he stretches a heavy fishing net underwater, set at a known depth. He has the submarine skipjack fire live Mark 14 torpedoes with dummy warheads through the net. Divers go down afterward and measure the holes. The torpedoes are running, on average, 11 feet too deep, exactly as the captains had been reporting for 18 months. The proof is undeniable. BUORD, embarrassed, finally begins to fix the depth control problem, then the magnetic exploder problem, then the contact exploder problem. Each fix takes months. The last of the three problems is not fully corrected until September 1943. Nearly 2 full years into the war, the standard American submarine torpedo finally works the way it was supposed to. Think about that. Think about the captains who had been called cowards. Think about the men who had been quietly fired from their commands, sent to desks in San Diego with reputations they could never repair. Some of them had not been cautious at all. Some of them had been doing everything right. The Navy had simply been giving them a weapon that was incapable of killing the enemy. History does not record their names with the same care it records the names of the men who came next. It records, instead, the name of Dudley Walker Morton. He is 35 years old in 1943. He was born in Owensboro, Kentucky, raised partly in Miami, and shaped by the United States Naval Academy class of 1930. He has the slow, easy drawl of a Southerner who is in no particular hurry to finish a sentence. His academy classmates gave him the nickname Mushmouth because of the way he spoke. It got shortened, the way nicknames do, to Mush. Mush Morton has, by the standards of the pre-war Navy, already failed. He commanded the old USSR-5, a small, obsolete submarine, for nearly 3 years before the war. When America entered the fight, he was given the USS Dolphin, a larger and newer boat. He was on her for less than 3 months. The Dolphin was a difficult vessel with chronic mechanical problems. The division commander above Morton decided that Morton was not handling the material difficulties to his satisfaction. Morton was quietly relieved of command in late 1942 and shipped to Brisbane to await reassignment. In the pre-war Navy, this was the end of a career. In Lockwood's Navy in early 1943, a man like Babe Brown reads through that record carefully. He looks at the evaluation. He looks at the reasons. He looks for one specific quality that the evaluation system was not designed to measure. He looks for hunger. What Brown sees in Morton's record is not failure. It is a man who had been chained to peacetime expectations and had broken them. A man who did not care particularly about polished brass and proper paperwork. A man who, if you gave him a submarine and pointed him at the enemy, would not come home with the torpedoes still in their tubes. Brown gives him another chance. He assigns Morton as prospective commanding officer aboard the USS Wahoo. The Wahoo is also, by any honest measurement, a failure. She is a brand new Gato-class boat only months out of the yard at Mare Island. She has completed 2 war patrols under her first captain, a lieutenant commander named Marvin Kennedy, who was known to his men as Pinky. On both patrols, she has come home with very little to show. The crew has lost faith in Kennedy. A sharp-eyed young lieutenant named Richard O'Kane has begun privately considering a transfer to another boat. The Wahoo was not making much of a record. O'Kane would later write, and we knew it. Pinky Kennedy is quietly relieved in late December 1942. Morton joins the Wahoo for one final patrol as observer under a different acting captain, then takes command himself in January 1943. The crew gathers in the forward torpedo room before the next patrol gets underway. The smell of fuel oil hangs in the still air. The young men, most of them under 25, stand silent in their dungarees, waiting to see what kind of officer they have inherited this time. Morton looks at them for a long moment. Then he speaks. "Wahoo is expendable," he says. The room goes very still. "We will take every reasonable precaution," he continues, "but our objective is to sink enemy shipping." Now, this is just my way of saying we are going to take risks. The crew can either go along with that or they can opt out. Any man who wants to remain behind has 30 minutes to notify the yeoman. No negative word will be said about anyone who does. He turns and walks out. Not a single man requests a transfer. What Morton has just done in those few sentences is rewrite the unwritten contract between an American submarine captain and his crew. Before that moment, the contract had been one of mutual survival. The captain would protect the boat. The crew would do their jobs and go home. Morton has just told them that home is no longer the point. Sinking ships is the point. And if the boat does not come back, then the boat does not come back. It is a contract that depends on absolute trust. Morton's first act as captain is to build it. He restructures the standard attack procedure. By doctrine, the captain runs the periscope during a submerged attack. He makes the visual observations. He calls out the bearings. He gives the orders to fire. Morton refuses to do it. He puts his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, on the periscope instead. Morton himself stays back at the plot, listening to the numbers, calculating the angles, watching the geometry of the kill on a sheet of glass and a string of grease pencil marks. It is a complete inversion. The man trained to make the decision is now staring at the math. The man trained to take orders is now staring at the enemy. O'Kane is 31 years old. He is from Dover, New Hampshire. He's intense, fast-thinking, and almost unhumanly cool under pressure. Morton has just told him, in effect, "I am betting both our lives on your eyes." The patrol that comes next will become one of the most famous in American naval history. In late January 1943, the Wahoo is patrolling off the coast of New Guinea. Morton has been told, in his orders, to reconnoiter the Japanese harbor at Wewak, to look at it, to bring back information, not to enter it. Morton intends to enter it. The Wahoo has no detailed chart of Wewak. The Navy did not provide one. The captain stands in the wardroom and asks if any man on board has anything that might help. A motor machinist's mate steps forward with a cheap school atlas he had picked up in a bookshop in Brisbane. The pages are thin, the scale is wrong. The harbor is rendered as a small blue inlet, with no soundings, no markers, no warnings. Morton spreads the school atlas on the wardroom table and announces that this is the chart they will use. On the morning of January 24, 1943, the USS Wahoo, a 311-foot American fleet submarine, slips submerged into a Japanese naval anchorage, navigating from a children's geography book. Inside Wewak, through the periscope, O'Kane spots a Japanese destroyer at anchor. The destroyer, post-war records, suggest is a Shiratsuyu-class vessel named Harasami. Morton orders the approach. The Wahoo eases forward. But the destroyer's crew sees something, a feather of wake, a glint, and the destroyer hauls up its anchor, comes about, and charges directly at the submarine. What Morton does next was at the time considered unthinkable in the American submarine service. By the book, the response to a charging destroyer is to dive deep and run silent and pray. Morton does the opposite. He orders the Wahoo to stay at periscope depth. He aims his bow torpedo tubes directly at the oncoming bow of the destroyer. And as the destroyer closes the range, he begins firing torpedoes straight down its throat. The first torpedo misses. The second misses. The third torpedo hits. The Harrison staggers in the water. Smoke pours from her amidships. She lists, settles, and her bow goes deep into the sea. From the periscope, the crew can see Japanese sailors leaping into the water. For the rest of the war, Mush Morton would be credited with sinking that destroyer. Submarine sailors throughout the Pacific would tell and retell the story of the down-the-throat shot at Wewak. It became a kind of scripture in the silent service. The truth, as it emerged in the cold light of post-war analysis, is slightly more complicated. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, working from captured Japanese records after the war, was unable to confirm that any Japanese destroyer was sunk at Wewak on January 24, 1943. The Harrison appears in Japanese records as damaged in that engagement, repaired and lost, later in the war, in 1944, to American aircraft in the Philippines. What Morton actually did at Wewak was less than what the legend remembers. But what he did to the morale of the United States submarine force was incalculable. Word of the attack spread through the boats at Pearl Harbor like fire through dry grass. A captain had gone inside a Japanese harbor, had taken on a destroyer head-to-head, and had come out alive. The unwritten doctrine of caution shattered in that one patrol. 3 months later, in the spring of 1940, Mush Morton took the Wahoo into the Yellow Sea, between the Korean peninsula and the Chinese coast, into waters no American submarine had ever entered. In a single patrol of just over 3 weeks, he claimed to have sunk 9 Japanese merchant ships. Post-war analysis confirmed somewhat fewer, but the post-war analysis is beside the point. He had brought the war to the doorstep of Tokyo. Lockwood, in his office at Pearl Harbor, finally had what he had been hunting for. He had a killer, and the killer had a student. But there was a second weapon now coming into play, and it had nothing to do with torpedoes or torpedo depth or sleek black hulls in the water. It had to do with a small, windowless building in Washington, D.C., where a few dozen men and women, mostly civilians, spent their days staring at columns of numbers. The building housed a naval intelligence section known as OP-20G. Its job was to break Japanese codes. The Japanese Navy used several codes. The most famous, JN-25, carried the operational orders of the combat fleet. Code breakers had been chewing at JN-25 for years. It was JN-25 fragments that had given the Americans the warning that led to victory at Midway. There was another code, smaller, less glamorous, dedicated to something the Japanese fleet considered beneath them, the merchant marine. It was known as the Maru Code, after the suffix Maru that traditionally identified Japanese civilian ships. By mid-1943, the men and women of OP-20G had broken it. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the United States Navy now knew, often within hours, the sailing schedules of every major Japanese convoy in the Pacific, the departure port, the destination, the route, the composition, the estimated speed of the slowest vessel, sometimes the names of the ships. This information went in carefully sanitized form to Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor. Lockwood, in turn, sent it out by radio to the submarines on patrol. A submarine captain in 1942 had hunted convoys the way a man with a flashlight hunts deer at night. He looked, he listened, he guessed where the deer might be. A submarine captain in late 1943 was being handed a map with an X drawn on it and a time written underneath. The combination is what wins the war. The aggressive captains, freed from the cautious doctrine, the torpedoes, finally functional, the codes finally cracked, the boats finally in position. In 1942, American submarines had sunk 134 Japanese merchant ships, totaling around 580,000 tons. In 1943, the number nearly tripled. 335 ships, 1.5 million tons. In 1944, it exploded into something that resembled extermination. 603 ships, 2.7 billion tons. More tonnage in 12 months than the United States submarine force had sunk in the previous 2 years combined. And it was no longer only merchant ships. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in June 1944, an American submarine called the USS Kavala put 4 torpedoes into the side of the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor itself. The Shokaku sank with most of her crew. Another submarine, the USS Albacore, put 1 torpedo into the brand-new Japanese carrier Taiho. The Taiho exploded hours later from accumulated aviation fuel vapors and went down with over 1,000 men. Off the coast of Formosa in November 1944, the USS Celian fired 6 torpedoes into the Japanese battleship Congo. The Congo, 28,000 tons of steel and gunpowder, rolled over and went to the bottom. She was the only Japanese battleship sunk by a submarine in the entire war. In the East China Sea, just 2 weeks later, a young Japanese carrier called the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built up to that point, slipped out of Tokyo Bay on her maiden voyage. She was almost 70,000 tons. She had been converted from the hull of a 3rd Yamato-class super battleship. She had been in service for less than 10 days. A submarine called the USS Archerfish, commanded by a 34-year-old lieutenant commander named Joseph Enright, put 4 torpedoes into her side. The Shinano sank inside 7 hours. She remains, to this day, the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. The Empire was bleeding to death in the open ocean, and the men in Tokyo were beginning, finally, to understand it. But the men in the boats, the killers Lockwood had chosen, and Babe Brown had championed, and Mush Morton had trained, were paying a price of their own. By the end of 1943, Morton was already dead. It is October 11, 1943. The USS Wahoo is running on the surface in the La Perouse Strait, the narrow stretch of water that separates the Russian island of Sakhalin from the northern tip of Japanese Hokkaido. She has just completed her 7th war patrol. She has sunk 4 Japanese vessels in the Sea of Japan, in waters no American submarine had operated in for more than a year. She is heading home. Mush Morton is 36 years old. He has been running his boats hard for 9 months. The exhaustion in him is the exhaustion of a man who has stopped counting the days. He is on the bridge, by some accounts, when a Japanese maritime patrol aircraft drops out of the low clouds. The Wahoo dives, but she dives too late. A bomb detonates close to her hull, then another, then another. Japanese patrol vessels summoned by the aircraft converge on the position and roll depth charges across the disturbed water until the disturbance stops. There are no survivors. All 80 men aboard the USS Wahoo go to the bottom of the strait. The wreck would lie there, undiscovered, for 63 years until Russian divers found her in 2006, lying on her side in 213 feet of water, her hull torn open behind the conning tower. When the news reaches Pearl Harbor, Charles Lockwood sits at his desk for a long time without speaking. He writes, in a private letter, the only kind of eulogy a submariner ever really gets. It just didn't seem possible that Morton and his fighting crew could be lost. I'd never have believed the Japs could be smart enough to get him. What Lockwood does not put on paper, what perhaps he cannot put on paper, is the thing every submarine commander in Pearl Harbor already knows. Mush Morton had been running on the surface in daylight in coastal waters, 200 miles from the Japanese home islands. He had been doing it for months. He had built a doctrine of aggression so total that his own caution had become a kind of foreign language to him. Wahoo is expendable, he had told the crew. He had meant it, and the crew had believed him. And on October 11, 1943, the contract that bound them all together came due. The student Morton had trained, Dick O'Kane, took everything he had learned aboard the Wahoo and refined it into something even more lethal. By the autumn of 1944, O'Kane was commanding the USS Tang. In 5 war patrols, the Tang and her crew had sunk more Japanese tonnage than any other American submarine of the war. The post-war accounting credited O'Kane with 24 ships and 93,824 tons. It was the highest verified total of any submarine commanding officer in the United States Navy. On the night of October 24, 1944, The Tang was on the surface in the Taiwan Strait. She had attacked a Japanese convoy a few hours earlier and torn it apart. She had one Mark 18 torpedo left, the 24th fish of the patrol. O'Kane fired it. The torpedo broached the surface. It turned. It began to circle back toward the boat that had launched it. The crew watched it come. O'Kane gave the order for emergency back full. The Tang shuddered in the water, trying to claw away. The torpedo hit her aft near the maneuvering room. The blast broke her in two. The forward half of the submarine remained on the surface for a few minutes. Then she began to sink. Of the 87 men aboard, 9 were on the bridge when the torpedo hit. They were thrown clear into the water. The other 78 men went down inside the hull. Some of them survived the initial sinking. 13 men in the forward torpedo room used the submarine escape trunk to swim toward the surface from a depth of 180 feet. 5 of them made it. The rest drowned in the darkness. Dick O'Kane spent the rest of the war in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. He was taken first to the brutal interrogation center at Ofuna, where his captors, the survivors of one of the very convoys he had attacked the night the Tang went down, took their revenge with fists and clubs. He weighed less than 100 pounds when American forces liberated him in August 1945. He had earned the Medal of Honor for his actions at the periscope of the Tang on the night she died. He lived another 49 years. He almost never spoke publicly about what he had done in the war. He died at his home in California in 1994. When the accountants of the war finally laid out the books, the numbers told a story that even the men who had lived through it found difficult to comprehend. The United States submarine force had sunk 1,314 Japanese vessels. It had destroyed 54.6% of all Japanese ships lost in the war. 1 Japanese battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, 42 destroyers, 25 submarines, more than 5 million tons of merchant and naval shipping. It had done all of this with less than 2% of the Navy's total personnel. Japan, the island empire that had launched its war to seize the oil and rubber and rice of Southeast Asia, had been starved into surrender. Oil imports had collapsed from 28 million barrels in early 1944 to less than 5 million by year's end. The merchant marine that carried the lifeblood of the empire had lost more than 75% of its tonnage by the spring of 1945. The Japanese cabinet would later testify to its own legislature that the greatest cause of defeat was the loss of shipping. The cost was carved on a stone wall. 52 American submarines did not return. 3,506 officers and enlisted men were lost beneath the Pacific. 1 in every 5 men who went on patrol did not come home. It was the highest loss rate of any branch of the United States military in the Second World War. And then, in the spring of 1946, the story took its final, strangest turn. In a courtroom in Nuremberg, Germany, a German admiral named Karl Dönitz stood trial for his life. Among the charges against him was the accusation that he had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied shipping. He had ordered U-boats to sink merchant ships without warning. The Allies in 1946 called this a war crime. On May 11, 1946, an affidavit arrived in the courtroom from across the Atlantic. It was signed by Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, United States Navy. It stated, in plain and methodical language, that the United States Navy had waged unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific Ocean from the first hour of December 7, 1941. It stated that American submarines had been ordered to sink Japanese merchant ships on sight without warning. It stated that this had been the deliberate policy of the United States government. Dönitz was convicted on other charges and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But on the specific charge of waging unrestricted submarine warfare, he was acquitted. Nimitz's affidavit had saved his life. The men of the Silent Service had won the Pacific War using methods that, on paper, were international crimes. The Navy that had asked them to use those methods could not afterward celebrate them too loudly. The submariners came home and went to work and got old without telling their grandchildren what they had done. 3,506 names are carved into memorials in Pearl Harbor and Groton, Connecticut. Most Americans have never visited them. Most Americans have never heard of Mush Morton or Dick O'Kane or Charles Lockwood or the 80 men who lie on their sides in the cold mud of the La Perouse Strait. The boats are still down there. They have been down there for more than 80 years now. They were never raised. The Navy does not raise its lost submarines. The boats are the graves of the men who served in them, and the men of the silent service stay together in the dark, the way they sailed, the way they fought, the way they were never quite allowed to be remembered.